full of possibilities. The future is not something we wait for. It is something we build. Together, the transition towards a more sustainable future is already underway. Across business, finance, cities, and society, new ideas are emerging, partnerships are growing, and solutions are taking shape. Welcome to Lisbon Sustainability Week 2026, a platform for collaboration, a space for dialogue, a catalyst for action. 3 days to share knowledge, to inspire leadership, to create partnerships, and to build practical solutions for a more resilient and prosperous future. Because sustainability is a shared responsibility. Let's work on building it together.
Hello, good morning everyone, and welcome to Lisbon Sustainability Week 2026, this year dedicated to building sustainability together. For more than 2 centuries, economic growth, innovation, and global markets have transformed human condition. They have generated prosperity, created opportunities, and improved lives around the world. But they have also revealed that our economic success had impact not only on our environment, but also on our societies. The question is, what kind of development do we want? And also, how can we build solutions together? And that is precisely why we are here today. Over the next days, Lisbon Sustainability Week will bring here together policymakers, business leaders, investors, academics, city leaders, and innovators to explore how sustainability can become from ambition to implementation. Not through isolated actions, but through collaboration, because sustainability is not a challenge that belongs to one sector, one institution, one country. It belongs to all of us. Before we dive into our sessions, I'd like to remind you that as a registered participant, you have access to our dedicated web app, your guide to the program, and also to our speakers' information, as well as to participate in the Q&As. You just have to pose a question by selecting the session, typing whatever you want to be explained, and then share it. To access, you have a QR code on the back of your badge, and the access code was sent to your emails. It is now my pleasure to invite the President of Fundação Santander Portugal to officially welcome you to Banco Santander and to Lisbon Sustainability Week 2026. Please welcome, with a warm round of applause, Inês Rocha de Gouveia. Good morning.
Hello, good morning to you all. I'm really very happy to be here and to host at Santander this event. Why at Fundação Santander? Why is it so nice and so intense? It's a true joy to have you all here because we share a vision and we build together. This is very important for us, the action. We don't only hope for a better future, but we act on it, and we act with a common goal. At Fundação Santander, we are very proud to be the founding partner of Católica and the Center for Sustainable Finance. This is really innovative, truly a new world, beginning a new world where we believe that our grandchildren will be proud having a better future. Today, as we speak, we are transmitting live streaming to Global Santander, So this is very important what we are going to say and reflect today. All the world at Santander, we will be reflecting on it and thinking about it. So this is a ripple effect we are very proud of. So happiness, proud, joy are all the feelings that I will warmly transmit to you. So feel it, enjoy it, and be inspired to go ahead, to continue reflecting and building a better world, because sustainability is really, really a shared responsibility that we started yesterday. So welcome, and it's Rita, back to you, or directly to Isabel, Rector of Universidade Católica Portugal. Welcome. Are you...
So good morning, everyone. I'm speaking from here because I have written remarks. I'm sorry, academics are usually boring people, and we write our things. So let me start by thanking our host, Fundação Santander, and its president for hosting us here. Santander is our partner from the inception of our project in sustainable finance, and it's really a pleasure to be here with you today. And on behalf of Católica, Catholic University of Portugal, welcome to the second Lisbon Sustainability Week. It is a privilege, truly, to open this event that is powered by Católica-Lisbon School of Business and Economics, alongside our partner, Santander, whose commitment to this initiative has been essential from the very beginning. When we launched the first edition of the week, we did so with a conviction that a university like ours has a responsibility not only to generate knowledge, but to put that knowledge at the service of the most pressing challenges of our time. That conviction has not weakened. If anything, it has grown more urgent. We live in a moment of profound disruption. Climate change is no longer a future risk. It is a present reality reshaping coastlines, supply chains, agricultural systems, and the lives of millions, our lives. Biodiversity is declining at a rate not seen since the age of the dinosaurs. Cities where more than half of humanity already lives face mounting pressure to decarbonize while continuing to deliver prosperity and opportunity. And the financial system, which ultimately allocates the capital that will either accelerate or arrest these trends, is still finding its footing in this new landscape. These are not peripheral concerns. They sit at the very heart of economics and management disciplines. For too long, our field operated on a comfortable fiction, that markets were self-contained, that externalities were footnotes, and that the purpose of a firm could be reduced to the maximization of shareholder value. That model is being challenged, not by ideology, but by reality. The companies, investors, and institutions that will thrive in the decades ahead are those that understand sustainability not as a constraint, but as a lens through which to see opportunity, manage risk, and create lasting value. Católica-Lisbon, our School of Business and Economics, has embraced an impact-driven approach to business education and research. And we owe it very much to our Dean, Philippe Santos, who is here, who is really a leader in shaping this outlook. And this means asking not only what is efficient, but efficient for whom and at what cost. It means training the next generation of leaders to account for the full consequences of their decisions on people, on nature, and on the communities they serve. And it means producing research that does not stop at the journal article, but reaches into the boardroom, the policy chamber, and the investment committee. This is, we believe, the future of management education. The separation between financial performance and social and environmental impact is dissolving, not because businesses have become more altruistic, but because the evidence increasingly shows that these things are deeply connected. Firms that ignore their environmental footprint face stranded assets and regulatory risk. Those that neglect social equity face talent shortages and reputational damage. And those that govern themselves poorly face the erosion of the very trust on which long-term value creation depends. The question before business schools, then, is not whether to engage with sustainability, it is whether we have the courage and the intellectual rigor to lead that conversation rather than follow it. I'm proud to say that Católica has chosen to lead. Over recent years, we have built one of the most active research agendas on sustainable finance and responsible business of any school. Our Center for Sustainable Finance, sponsored and supported by Santander, and our Center for Responsible Business bring together faculty, students, practitioners, and policymakers in precisely the spirit of this week: rigorous, applied, and committed to impact. Our researchers publish in the world's leading journals, but they also engage directly with firms navigating the sustainability transition, with regulators designing new frameworks, and with investors seeking to align their portfolios with the world they want to see. Lisbon Sustainability Week is itself an expression of that commitment, led by Católica-Lisbon. It is a platform we created because we believe this city, this country, and this institution had something meaningful to contribute to one of the great conversations of our time. It is our mission as a university. The response from speakers, from participants, from partners has confirmed that belief. I want to welcome as well the three remarkable keynote speakers that we have: Professors John Elkington, Professor Cameron Hepburn, Professor Robert Engle, and all the other speakers who will be sharing their knowledge throughout these 3 weeks. And let me end by saying that sustainability is sometimes spoken of as a sacrifice, as the cost we must pay to avoid catastrophe. I would like to suggest a different frame. Done well, the transition to a sustainable economy is one of the great opportunities of our era, for innovation, for investment, for the redesign of institutions that serve people better and last longer. The task of business schools and the task of universities is to help leaders see that opportunity clearly and to give them the tools to seize it responsibly. That is what this week is about, and I can't think of no better place to have this conversation than here in Lisbon, a city that has always known how to look outward and how to navigate uncertain waters. On behalf of Católica, I wish you all a stimulating, challenging, and genuinely productive week. Thank you.
Our final session brings us one of the world's foremost experts on risk measurement and financial volatility. You already know who I am talking about, but to introduce our next guest speaker, I am happy to call Professora Susana Campos-Martins to come on stage. Please, a round of applause. Professora. And now, the stage is yours.
Okay. Is this working? Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. It is my great pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker, my colleague, my co-author, friend, and one of the most influential economists of our time, Professor Rob Engle. So many of you know Rob as the recipient of the 2003 Nobel Prize in Economics for his groundbreaking methods for analyzing economic data with time-varying volatility. So Rob's fundamental insight was that volatility is not constant. No, it evolves over time, it is persistent, and meaning that days of high volatility in the markets are followed by days of high volatility. So this volatility clustering creates the conditions that allow us to model and forecast volatility, tools that are much needed in financial markets, but also in many other areas of economics. So Rob's original work was, the volatility of inflation of in the UK, but his models have also been applied to volatility of GDP growth, temperature variations, interest rates, and the list goes on. His work has collected the astronomical number of 200,000 citations. Wow. By bringing econometric methods to finance, Rob fundamentally changed the way investors, economists, central banks, regulators look at risk. So his work laid the foundations of an entirely new field in economics called financial econometrics, which develops the statistical and econometric tools that underpin modern financial analysis and risk management. All this is brilliant, no doubt, but what I find most remarkable about Rob is that he never stops looking for the next important question, or as he likes to say, the questions of the future. So for decades, his work has been guided by a deceptively simple question. How do we measure risk in a changing world? So after transforming the study of financial volatility, Rob turned his attention to systemic risk, a critical issue that helped us understand the global financial crisis, and then to global and geopolitical risks. His recent research has been devoted to one of the defining challenges of our time, climate change, and that is the topic of his lecture today. On a personal note, when I first met Rob at a conference, we found ourselves laughing, or, well, I was laughing, not sure you was laughing when he was telling me this, about the time when he and his wife Marianne rented a car in Evran, and they faced the consequences of putting gasoline into a diesel engine. Well, if there was an electric vehicle available for rent at the time, surely that would not have happened. But I'm not trying to embarrass Rob, of course. But looking back at the time, that seemed like a practical problem. But, you know, I think it actually was a fitting introduction to someone who has spent a lifetime trying to understand risk and thinking about risk. You know, most of us start paying attention to risk after something goes wrong, but Rob, you know, spent decades of his research trying to, helping us understand risk before it even materializes. So today, as we confront profound uncertainties surrounding climate change, sustainability, technological transformation, you know, and the future of our economies, I can think of no one better to help us understand the risks ahead. So Rob, we look forward to your talk. Before we give the word to you, Mark Becht is going to say a few words about this Wallenberg Lecture. Thank you.
Now, as many of you have seen on the program, so first of all, my name is Marco Becht. I'm a professor of finance and the executive director of ECGI. Now, as many of you have seen, this is not just a Nobel lecture, but it's also the ECGI Wallenberg Lecture, which marks a collaboration between Católica and ECGI. So I've been asked to say 2 words about ECGI, 3 words about the Wallenberg Lecture, and then 4 words about Rob. Okay, so ECGI was set up in 2002 together with a great Portuguese scholar, businessman, leader, Antonio Borges, the late Antonio Borges. I've had the privilege of working with him for 10 years. Those Portuguese attendants who don't know who he was, please Google him. He really was a great man. He was also Professor Católica, and he's greatly missed, certainly by me. He died too young. Now, we set up ECGI together, which at the time was America-dominated academic research, and the idea was that Europe had things to show, and I think he would be extremely pleased with what you're doing, Antonio and Susana, with this event, and he would be very proud of what his university is achieving. So we set out on this little venture, which today has 500 members from all over the world. It's ecgi.global, and it does things. So we had, with Antonio, we went to Stockholm and we got support from the Wallenberg family. They are a family foundation. We had a paper this morning on families and whether they are more committed or less committed to net zero. We learned that some of them are not, others are. And LLM research this morning showed that actually the Wallenbergs are quite committed to net zero. So we are proud, but I think we've chosen well to name the lecture after them. I think, Rob, you are not giving a lecture in the name of a family that doesn't deserve you giving the lecture, I think. Okay, now, so then the second thing I want to say is Rob. So Rob is a research member of ECGI, and he very kindly agreed in 2024 to speak at the ECGI Responsible Capitalism Summit, which was held at the French Embassy in Berlin on Pariser Platz, and it was about the Paris Agreement, a decade after Paris, accelerating the path to net zero. This was in November 2024. The world has changed since then. And Rob, you spoke about termination risk, and I don't know what you're going to talk about today, but I'm certainly going to look forward to hearing from you what has changed since 2024 and what has stayed the same. Thank you very much for agreeing to give the 2026 Wallenberg Lecture. Thank you, Rob.
Well, thank you, Marco. Thank you, Susana. It's great pleasure to be with you here today. Is the microphone doing okay? Do I hear a little echo? Perfect. Okay, that's good to hear. So I'm glad to be with you. You've had a long day of interesting talks. We had an interesting day upstairs talking about some of the academic work, and you talked a little bit about the practical implementation of sustainability. And I'm going to try to put these two ideas together today. And let's see. And I've chosen to call this lecture with a question mark: can we stop climate change? And of course, the thing about a question like this is the answer is very easy. Yes, we can, but will we? And that's what I want to talk about. Will we get around to stopping climate change? And I'm going to show you, first of all, some of the research that we do at the Volatility and Risk Institute, which tries to measure the impact, the extent of climate risk and its impact on asset prices. So it's really the market's view of how important climate risk really is. Then I'm going to discuss termination risk, which is a relatively new idea in how companies might view their long-term future. And it has implications for, lots of implications for behavior, and we want to see whether those are actually in the data. We'll look at a lot of different data series for a quick look to see about whether termination risk seems like a plausible idea. And then we'll look at some current events and prospects. And here's where I'm going to try to show what Marco just alluded to. What's new? What's changed since November 2024? And I think we all can think of a lot of things that have changed since that period 2 years ago. So let me have you put a hat on, pretend you're the prime minister or the governor or the president of one of the countries that signed the Paris Agreement in 2015, and you came home after this wonderful meeting, everybody is excited, you came home and asked yourself, how can I get my country to be net zero by 2050? I signed this document, said I was going to do that. How do I do it? So probably what you would do is you would ask your economic advisors, how do I do this? And here's what I think they would have said. I think they would say, climate change is really a problem of what economists call externalities, and externalities are an important part of economics because these are problems where the people that get the damages are not the people that cause the damages. And so it's very difficult for the market to solve problems of externalities. We have the problem we call free riders. Free riders are people that don't do anything about the climate, but take advantage when other people do. So the government really has to intervene in the market. And what are their choices? Well, here are 4 choices that the government has, and it might be that different ones would be appropriate for different countries. That would be natural, I think. One is to tax carbon emissions. This is a choice that the European Union has made with the ETS system. It's, I think, pretty effective. Perhaps not a full solution, but pretty effective. A second is to subsidize renewable energy. This is really the choice that America made a few years ago, and which has been eroded, actually, in the meantime. A third solution is to regulate emissions, that is, make things sort of illegal. Emissions are illegal, or making appliances that use too much energy illegal, and various ways to do that. And the fourth one I call hope. You might wonder, what do I mean, hope? Well, often that's called do nothing. But it's a little bit better than that, because it's hoping that all of us, just like the citizens in our country, want to do the right thing. And so employees and investors and CEOs and shoppers who are in the supermarket will all decide to do something a little bit greener than they did before. And together, that will be enough to achieve net zero. Economists are pretty skeptical that that's going to work because of the free rider problem. But of course, this is where we all started, because there were no policies at all at the beginning. And so the question is, are we going to do something better than hope that it all works out? So when we get to talking about decarbonization, there are difficult political issues. There are always winners and losers. Some companies, some individuals are winners. They do well with the decarbonization. Others are losers. And so this affects the way they view their future, and in a way affects the way investors view their future. Investors would like to pick winners and losers from decarbonization and use that to improve their portfolio performance. But of course, they don't know whether we're going to do this or not. So investors who put in place strategies picking winners and losers are in fact picking an idea of how much decarbonization will really come out of the political system. And so I'm going to show you with this kind of idea that the policies that we do are uncertain, might be implemented, might not. This is a risk that companies face, and it shows up in asset prices today. So how do we measure something like this? We're going to create hedge portfolios, which are portfolios of winners and losers. These are going to be portfolios of stocks which see this risk as an opportunity, and short assets which are negatively exposed to the risk. And so if this risk increases, this portfolio will go up, because the longs will go up and the shorts will go down. So if it's carefully constructed, it won't respond to many other kinds of risks, because everything else might be the same between the longs and the shorts. And so this is a way of measuring the market's view as to the likelihood that this policy will be put in place. So investors might choose to hold this portfolio if they think the policy is really going to happen. But if it's not going to happen, then it's just a hedge, which means that if it happens, you do well, and you do well, but the world is doing kind of badly because climate is getting worse. If you don't, if you hold this hedge and the risk does not materialize, then your portfolio will, let's see, it's going to reduce your risk because you don't know whether this policy is going to happen or not. So it's a risk-reducing portfolio, and like an insurance policy, it should have a negative expected return unless this policy actually is implemented. So let me show you how this works out. One of the most important applications of this is to banks. Are banks exposed to climate risk? We would, if we put in place a good decarbonization policy, it would be terrible if it managed to, at the same time, create a banking crisis. So we hope that the banks are not going to be too exposed to this kind of climate risk. And so we constructed a hedge portfolio which is long the world's market index, the ACWI index, and short two energy exchange-traded funds, which represent the returns on fossil energy companies. And what we're going to look at is whether bank stocks are correlated with this hedge portfolio, because as the risk of putting in place a serious decarbonization policy, as that changes, the value of this hedge portfolio goes up and down. And so if it looks like we're really going to impose this policy, then we'd like to know whether bank stocks are going to collapse or go up. And that depends on whether they are already making loans to the companies that are going to fail if this policy is put in place. So we do this calculation in a paper, but we also do it every day. We do it every day with new information from the day's stock markets all around the world for about 1,000 banks and other financial institutions. We calculate the exposure of these institutions to this stranded asset portfolio and whether they are actually going to be insolvent as a result of that. So, where can you find this? It turns out you can find this on VLab, which is our website, and if you want, you can see it on your phone sitting in this room. It's a public website, and the web address is at the bottom. Of course, it's not easy to remember things like that, so if you go to Google and you say, find VLab at NYU, it'll just take you right there. Okay, so I'm going to show you two numbers, or two time series. One is called C-risk, for climate risk, and that's a measure of whether the banks have sufficient capital to withstand this climate event that we are hypothesizing. That is, the decarbonization. So it's a measure of capital adequacy. The second is what we call marginal C-risk, which is a measure of the exposure to this event. And they're different because the amount of exposure does not tell you whether this exposure is going to put you into an untenable financial position or not. So let's look at the results. For example, here are the C-risk and marginal C-risk for the US as a whole. And this is, just a couple days ago. The top curve is the C risk, which is the capital adequacy measure. And when it's high, it means the banking sector is at risk. It might need to be bailed out, and the price on this axis is sort of what the government would have to pay to bail out all the banks in the US. So you see it had a big peak during the pandemic. And that's exactly when we did a very strong decarbonization by stopping driving, stopping flying, Zooming to meetings, no meetings like this. And as a result, the oil companies did very badly. Some of the price of oil went negative one day. The oil companies it was not clear they were going to survive if this kept going, but lo and behold, the demand for oil came back after the pandemic was over, and you see the curve came back down again. We also see a secondary peak here, which is what we call the mini financial crisis in the US. It's when we had inflation and several banks failed because they were holding long-term US treasuries as part of their reserves, and those went down in value substantially. This measure was put in place during the financial crisis in 2008 and 9, and it worked nicely here in 2023. So we're very pleased about the precision with which we could see this kind of event. But you see that the second one is not associated with exposure to climate risk in the bottom. It's just that the banks were undercapitalized. And so when you look at the bottom blue curve, you're looking at how exposed the US banking system is to climate change. And the answer is, well, since the pandemic, it really hasn't been too exposed. It's been pretty neutral. It's a little bit up, a little bit down, and actually right at the end, which is the period since the meeting in Berlin, it's actually negative. So the banks seem to be negatively related to this. It means that they're perhaps more invested in renewable energy than in fossil energy. Europe has not recovered as much from the pandemic, but it is recovering, and it is now pretty low in terms of its exposure to fossil energy. In fact, the bottom curve turns negative just about a year ago. If you look at the world as a whole, you can see that it has recovered even less in terms of its capital adequacy, and that it's got a positive marginal C risk all the way through to the end, and just a touch negative at the end. So this is a monitor. And what we think we're doing with VLab is providing tools so that you can monitor the assets. And if you go to the website, you can see we do this for each bank and then add it up. So I'm not showing you banks, I'm just showing you totals. Okay, so that's one way that we've measured the impact of climate risk on financial firms. Here's another question. What do we mean by green and brown stocks? If you wanted to invest in green stocks, and the European Union has worked hard on trying to define this, how would you define it? Well, what I think a good definition is green stocks are winners in a transition risk, and brown stocks are losers in transition risk. And so at least the market's view of green and brown stocks is how do they respond? Are they positively or negatively correlated to hedge portfolios that we construct for these possible risks? And the risks we're going to use are, again, the carbon tax, renewable subsidies, and regulation. And so what we've done in this paper, which goes by the title of Mirror, Mirror on the Wall, who's the greenest of us all? I don't know, did you use that phrase when you were growing up, or your children were growing up, or your grandchildren? At least some of them. I probably did see this Snow White movie or a children's story. So what do we see? Well, on average, we look at the S&P 500, that's 500 stocks. On average, the ones on the left are the 10 highest, so those are the greenest, and the ones on the right are the 10 lowest. They're the brownest. And these are not the ones that necessarily we would, as individuals, think are the greenest or brownest, but they're the ones that we think the market views as the greenest and the brownest. And you'll see on the left there are a lot of utilities. Many of these utilities are actually actively engaged in renewable energy. And of course, electricity generation is part of decarbonization. We're going to use a lot more electricity if we decarbonize than we do now. And on the right, we see industrials who are users of oil and gas and are therefore going to be hurt dramatically by high energy prices and decreased supplies. And then also we see energy companies themselves. So we do a bunch of things in addition in this paper, which I'm not going to show you. I'm going to show you what I think of as the sort of the ChatGPT overview of what's happened. That is, we estimate a logistic model which estimates the probability that a company will look like it's green in a certain year and the probability that it will look brown in a certain year as a function of a bunch of characteristics. And what do we find? Well, we find that green firms typically have high profit margins, high price-to-book ratios, low long-term debt and interest expense, and low volatility, high intangible assets, and high R&D. They have low emissions. Interestingly, ESG data is not significant in this regression, and the E score has a negative sign. So the market seems not to be using E-scores or ESG scores, but they are interested in emissions. Brown firms have a characteristic of sort of the opposite of this: low advertising, low profit margins, high interest expense, low price-to-book ratio, low capital expenditures and intangibles, high volatility, and high emissions. Their E-score is also insignificant, or actually significantly, but with the wrong sign. Okay, what are we going to do with all this information? Well, we'd like to know what it is that's driving all this. And I think the answer to this is, at least in part, what I call termination risk. And this, of course, is a picture of the dodo, which is an extinct bird. It experienced termination risk in the extreme. And we're wondering whether there are other companies that are going to experience termination risk just like the dodo. And if so, how do we manage these kinds of companies? You might be, instead of being the prime minister, maybe you're the owner of one of these companies. How do you manage it? So the risk, of course, the dodo didn't know it was going to be extinct. These companies don't know they're going to become extinct, but there is a risk that they'll become extinct. And that risk, just like the other risks we've been talking about, drive asset prices. And that's what we want to look at. How do they do that? So let's, again, pretend that you're the owner of a company that faces termination risk. And this, let's call it a luxury beachfront hotel. Okay, you've all been in beautiful beachfront hotels. There are so many around here along the coast of Portugal and Spain. But when sea level rises and the storms come, some of these hotels are going to be destroyed. And if we wait long enough, they'll probably all get destroyed. So how do you manage that? So this is climate change, but it's a problem that you would face whether it's technology change or some other kind of competition or policy change. Other things can also cause termination risk. And so it's important to think about when you're managing a company, not just how do you grow this company. That's what we teach in business school. We should also teach how do you manage a declining company. It's not obvious how you do that. So just let's think with me about what we're going to say. Well, I'll tell you one thing. You'd probably like to sell it if you could, but who are you going to sell it to? Somebody that doesn't know about this. Okay, so maybe that's not really an option. Another choice might be to decide not to upgrade the hotel. Don't expand it. If you do an expansion, what's the break-even time period for it? If it's long compared to the termination date, you shouldn't do it. So you might reduce investment. You might reduce even maintenance. You might even reduce taxes if you think it's going to happen pretty soon. And then, of course, if you do this, these are costs that you're not paying. So actually, the revenue that you're getting from the room rent is going to go much more into your pocket than it would if you did all this investment for the future. But even more than that, if other hotels are doing the same, then maybe the aggregate supply would shrink and there would be a rising rate. There's sort of a monopoly rent that might occur from everybody shrinking their supply, and that would make your profits look high as well. So there are ways that this hotel owner might increase his cash flow by these kinds of processes. And maybe he would even offer you a share of stock. Maybe he would sell stock in this hotel. But would anybody buy stock in a hotel that was going to be destroyed in a few years? Really? Why would anybody buy a stock that's going to go to zero? Well, fortunately, business schools teach the answer to that question. The answer to that question is the stock would be worth the present discounted value of the cash flows until the termination date. So it's got a random stopping point, but it's got value. So you would be able to sell stock in this, and the stock would have a price which might be relatively low compared to its earnings. because there aren't that many years of earnings that are going to come before the termination rate. So we might expect to see low price to earnings ratios. We might also expect low price to book ratios because the market value of this hotel is going to be a lot less than its book value. There is risk here, so you might expect high returns, high expected returns. Even though it's going to zero, you might expect you might require a high return to take it, to buy this stock. You would expect to see declining market capitalization because the time to termination is getting shorter. And somehow we're talking about a high return on stock and a falling market cap. How can you do that? It turns out that dividends, for example, are one way to do that. You pay out big dividends. Another way to do that is you buy back shares. And this is how investors get their money back, even though the price goes to zero. You might expect low long-term debt, since no one would want to lend this hotel money over a long term, because it would be, you'd face default on this debt. And there are two other things that I want to say. One thing is that the owner of this hotel, which is you folks, might decide that you are going to diversify, that you might decide to start making electric vehicles or something else that might be sort of green or something like that. Would the investors be happy about that? They might not, because if they might think that you don't know what you're doing, or they might think that making electric vehicles doesn't have anything to do with running a hotel, and therefore your stock would go down in value, and so you wouldn't do that. So we might not expect diversification as a solution from these companies, from your hotel. But you might expect instead consolidation. In other words, you might buy the neighboring hotel as well, so that you don't have a price war. Your neighbor doesn't lower his room rent, and then you have to lower yours, and then you have a price war as well as termination risk. That would be really bad. So consolidation might be good. And so these are some things we look at if we think a company is facing termination risk. So now I have to ask you, do fossil energy companies face termination risk? That's the question that I've set up for you, and I'm going to quickly go through some data on just these things. For example, here is a picture of what the Paris Accord is supposed to look like over time. And if you think there is a chance that this is going to happen, you're facing termination risk, because your business is going to zero in this chart. But if you look at the data, you see that at least natural gas is still increasing. You, however, do see that coal is decreasing, and petroleum has turned it's past its peak and is now starting to slightly decline, and that renewable energy is low but rising. So there's plausibility to termination risk in this picture. If you look at the market cap of different industries that are all oil and gas kinds of industries, you see that it was much higher in 1980 than it is today. And so we do think that market cap has actually been declining over time. What about the PE? Here is the PE as of January 24th, 2026. That's this January. This is after 1 year of President Trump in the US, and you see energy is still got the lowest price-earnings ratio. So whatever President Trump has done over the year has not changed its PE ratio relative to its competitor, the other sectors. Price-to-book ratio is also basically the lowest, I think, of all sectors. If you look at the dividends, you see the dividends are really the highest in energy sector of all sectors except for maybe real estate. And finally, if you look at long-term debt relative to equity, you see it's very low for the energy sector. And only other one that's close is technology, which doesn't have much debt at all. How about investment? This is a picture of investment in rotary rigs. So this is a way of drilling, and you see this has been much higher in the past than it is today, and especially the natural gas has really declined, and so have the totals. Mergers and acquisitions. Well, in just a few months ago, the US government sort of captured Venezuela. It's now trying to persuade oil majors to invest in Venezuela, and there seems to be a lack of interest in this. In 2023, ExxonMobil purchased Pioneer, Chevron purchased Hess, and in 2019, Occidental purchased Anadarko. All of these are consolidations. They're not really expansions. And this is, again, something we expected to happen if these companies are facing termination risk. The purchasing company is maybe expanding the number of drilling rigs that it has, but the purchased company is terminating. So this really is a kind of an example of how you might terminate your company. You sell it to your competitors. So what are the implications of all this? If I've convinced you that fossil energy looks like it faces termination risk, what the implication is that President Trump's efforts to support fossil energy, and coal in particular, have not been very effective in raising PE ratios or price-to-book ratios or increasing investment. The ratios have increased a little bit, but they're still the lowest sector. Planning by fossil energy firms will take termination risk into account, and the long-term threat of decarbonization will continue to drive emissions downward, even in the face of government resistance. Climate silence will not stop climate change. So the efforts, the anti-climate efforts of policies by the US administration will probably just postpone the decline. They won't stop it. But what does the energy sector think? Well, I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago that some of you also attended, and a top banker from Houston, who actually does a lot of the lending to the energy and oil and gas sector, gave his view of what the energy market looks like. He said there's a new capital discipline. 50% of all cash flow should be returned to investors. Well, this is the high dividends and the high buybacks that we've just observed. He said there are big scars from 2016 and 2019 and COVID overinvestment. A lot of capital was deployed for exploration that didn't find much. So in other words, there's no reason to do a lot of exploring and new drilling because it didn't show up much before. But from termination risk, we have a different explanation of the same phenomena. He said, private equity invested massively in shale but was hit by 2015, 2016, when the shale revolution ended. Thereafter, investors required cash flow returns. So this is, again, an explanation for why even shale doesn't feel like it wants to expand. And he summarized it, markets matter more than policy. Okay. So if this is the case, then what's happened to sustainable investments? I think some of you in the sessions today looked at sustainable investing and whether it's profitable or not. What did you see? When you look at VLab, one of the things you can see is some tables of what sustainable investments really look like. And here is what you would see if you looked January, which is the day that Trump was, after 1 year of Trump. And on the left are 1 year returns. So this is the first year of Trump's presidency. And for 154 sustainable funds, the annual return was 27%. That is pretty good, right? 27%, that's great. The volatility was 20%, Sharpe ratio was bigger than 1, and the alpha, the CAPM alpha, which is really what you would expect to make every year by adding this to your portfolio of the S&P itself, was 10%. You would outperform the S&P by 10% if you had this average of this portfolio of these sustainable funds for a year. It's really not a story of sustainability failing. This is sustainable investing being very profitable. If you look over the right-hand chart, it's a 5-year statistics, and you see it's still positive, but not nearly as lucrative. So this is now 4 years of Biden and 1 year of Trump. And the net effect is a Sharpe ratio of only 0.2 and actually a CAPM alpha of minus 4.5%. But how about now? I mean, we've just had the Gulf War, or we're still having the Gulf War, and all these things that have happened since January. What's that done to this table? Well, the average of all these sustainable funds now, average return is now actually 30%. It's gone up. Even all the stuff that's going on, the sustainable funds are actually doing better. Even these high oil prices, which make oil companies happy, haven't actually increased their returns so much, but instead they've decreased the returns of companies that use a lot of oil. And they're in these sustainable funds too, in the other direction. So, and the Sharpe ratio now 1.28. So anyway, and what should you invest in now? Well, the top 5 funds as of more or less tomorrow, I guess this is. Number 1 is a lithium miners and producers ETF. Number 2 is a hydrogen ETF. 3 is lithium and battery. 4 is a clean tech, and 5 is an alternative energy fund. And look at the returns on these. For the 1 year return, 115%, 123%, and so forth. And CAPM alphas of 50%, 40%, 30%. This was a year to be in sustainable funds. I don't know about next year, but this was a year to be in sustainable funds. And actually, 103 out of 150 had alphas bigger than 0. But when the 5-year returns, only 13 out of 120 had alpha bigger than 0. So the final thing I want to talk a little bit about is global climate politics. So here's our friendly American eagle. Does it make you feel warm and cuddly? Okay. The U.S. has canceled lots of its climate regulations and climate incentives. It's been a disastrous year for climate advocates, I would say, in the U.S. And we, I think, have become a free rider country. That is a country that's not going to decarbonize even though the rest of the world does it. So this is a serious problem in achieving the Paris Agreement. If we don't get the Paris Agreement, unless we all get to net zero by 2050, and if the U.S. is a free rider, this is a big country to be out of the Paris Agreement. However, in game theory, which is what I'm talking about when I talk about free riders, as well as in life, there is a better solution. There's a better solution, which is when all countries cooperate in decarbonizing. We can achieve better outcomes by cooperating, but each country has an incentive on its own not to cooperate. How do you deal with this when you don't have some kind of a government to put this all together? This is the problem that we all face, and this is one of the reasons why it seems unlikely that we are going to actually stop climate change. We can't really cooperate very well. Fortunately, there are some economic reasons to decarbonize that don't involve cooperation. The fact is, renewable energy is now cheaper than fossil energy, and it therefore makes decarbonization an opportunity rather than a cost in many countries and sectors. So free riders are actually paying a higher price by failing to decarbonize. They also fail to sell their green technology to a global market, which is another profitable strategy which will have the benefit of helping the planet decarbonize. The vast demand for power for AI will require big investments in renewable energy because it's cheap and fast, and because AI demand should be able to tolerate intermittency of solar and wind, which makes it energy even cheaper. And finally, the disruption in the oil and gas market from the US and Israeli war with Iran is likely to leave fossil energy prices elevated for a long period. This will stimulate renewable energy investments, and the risk of high fossil energy prices and exposure to geopolitical risks make renewable energy look even more attractive. So maybe even without government incentives, there are reasons to decarbonize. This is the hope policy. But it does seem sort of like economics may be working with the hope to make it more effective. What is this? This is a solar farm in Shenzhen in China. And as you can see, it's massive. China has invested in green technology in an amazing way, which is providing a model for how green technology can be developed and marketed. Here is a picture of the Tallaton Solar Park, which is another park. And superimposed on this graph is a scale image of Manhattan. And what you see is these solar farms are bigger than Manhattan itself. So basically, renewable energy has helped China power 30,000 miles of high-speed train routes and its growing fleet of electric cars. And it enables us to manufacture all sorts of goods and sell them all over the world. In other words, it's taking advantage of its skill in developing these technologies to make profitable deals with the rest of the world. And the United States is actively trying not to do this. And it seems like shooting yourself in the foot, to use a US expression. Why are we avoiding doing these things which are cleaner, better, and profitable? Even for the rest of the world, where power lines are non-existent, you get these benefits. Here's the evidence that wind and solar are cheaper than natural gas and are growing faster. You can see this chart shows that wind and solar are now 17% of the US electricity grid. That's been rising. If you look at the new growth of power generation in the US in this year of 2025, you can see that half of it is solar. 28% is battery storage, wind is 14%, and natural gas is 7%. So 7% of the new power generation in the US is all that's being done for solar. And this is in spite of all the incentives that are being proposed. And where are these plants going? They're going all over the country. This is, the yellow are solar, the green is wind. Coal is black. You don't see any black on there. Batteries, nuclear, and are all showing on there. So the U.S. is trying to do this even without direction from the government. And this is good news from the climate community, I think. So will we stop climate change? I'm an optimist and believe that ultimately renewable energy will be so desirable that it will dominate our energy market. I believe that the economic policies of the Trump administration will be damaging to the U.S. and to the rest of the world and will be reversed or revised. A big problem with industrial policy is that it's so likely to subsidize weak firms and weak strategies. And that, I think, is what we're doing. The captains of industry will see that deregulation and lower corporate taxes lead to massive deficits, but not national prosperity. The electorate will, I hope, re-embrace climate mitigation as climate disasters like the heat wave last week, etc., happen. And I can only hope that this will all occur in time to repair international relations and reduce both climate and other geopolitical risks. So, in closing, here's a picture of 3 of my grandsons. I have 5 grandsons, and this is 3 of them. They're looking out over a beautiful, calm lake. And this lake makes them wonder, what's it going to look like when we grow up? Is it going to be too hot? Is it going to be there? Is it going to be storms? What's it going to be like? They're very worried. They tell us they're worried. They don't know what the world is going to be like for them. But if we can tell them that we have it solved, they'll be very happy. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, again, for being here, sharing your insights with us, and for helping us build sustainability together. So I thought I would organize this discussion around those three words that make up the theme of the conference. And in the meantime, I'll let people, submit questions through the app. So let's start with the last word, together.
Okay.
You started your presentation with the Paris Agreement, signed, adopted in 2015 by 200 countries, right, with the same goal of combating climate change and build a sustainable future. So back then there was this broad optimism that countries would move, if not with the same ambition and at the same pace, they would move in the same direction, right? We were in this together, building sustainability together, right? But that assumption is increasingly being challenged. You mentioned Trump administration, withdrawal from the Paris Agreement already twice, its efforts to actually expand domestic fossil fuel production, right? So very different approach from the European Union's climate agenda. On top of that, not very good news, multiple studies show that the climate pledges by countries under the Paris Agreement, they fall short of what is needed to achieve its goals, right? The 1.5 degrees Celsius goal is unlikely, increasingly unlikely, if not impossible already.
I think we've missed it already.
Right? So climate change is a problem that cannot be solved locally. More than ever, we need domestic policies aligned with the strong global climate commitments. So my question is, can global climate action survive when economies pursue fundamentally different climate strategies?
So, does this work? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't think there's any reason why countries have to follow the same policies. And I particularly suggested that there are choices there that the presidents would have to follow to see which was going to be the easiest thing to do or the most efficient thing or most effective thing. But if some countries decide not to do it, the so-called free rider countries, then it becomes much harder to persuade others to continue decarbonizing, especially if it's costly. I mean, that's the advantage of this idea that decarbonizing may not be so expensive, that decarbonization is just a good investment. It's not an investment that has to be motivated by climate change. It's just kind of a smart investment. But I don't really know whether that is going to be enough to get us to net zero. And I think that's kind of the question you're asking. Even if decarbonization is profitable, will we decarbonize fast enough? Will we be able to decarbonize not just electricity generation, but also decarbonize industrial policies, which are much more difficult in many cases to decarbonize. So I think it's a good start. I think we need some good advocates in government circles to keep us going, and probably a lot of good ideas. Good ideas as to how to decarbonize, how to change the technology of production that is so important. I mean, cars are a good example of this. I would guess that 10 years ago, nobody in this room would believe that electric vehicles would be so easy to drive and live with and recharge, and batteries could be last as long as they have. So we've had a whole lot of technology there, and we need a lot more to deal with steel and aluminum and concrete and all sorts of industrial processes that use a lot of heat and fossil energy.
So would you say European firms, they can remain globally competitive, while Europe is still internalizing climate costs and other major economies?
Well, European firms of course, are paying carbon taxes when firms around the world are not. And that's a problem for their competitiveness. And actually, I think the European Union has a relatively clever solution, which is this carbon border adjustment mechanism, the CBAM, which has been in a trial mode for maybe 2 years now, and is I think about to go live, and will encourage countries around the world either to put a carbon tax on themselves so they don't have to pay the European Union for their difference, or maybe the European Union will take in extra revenue, and that will make up for the cost differential for the firms producing in Europe that have to pay the carbon tax.
I think that's reassuring for sure for European firms. So maybe let's move to the second word, sustainability.
Okay.
You also mentioned, geopolitical shocks of recent years are changing the energy debate, right? We see that governments now are a lot worried about energy affordability, independence, security. So as if there is this trade-off between, decarbonization and energy security. So if you have a slow decarbonization, it may increase your dependence on fossil fuels. If it's fast decarbonization, then it may increase your dependence on imported materials, green technology. I'll give you another example of how these risks can increase for energy security. So last year, I don't know if you remember, there was an Iberian Peninsula blackout. So Portugal and Spain were...
Spain, right. Oh, my goodness.
Right. 10 hours, no energy, millions of people without energy. And the likely cause was that, we have an electricity system with a very high share of renewable energy. So this is well established, the increased risk of large-scale blackouts. We could also talk about AI when we talk about energy security. My first question would be, do you see it this way, that there is this sort of trade-off, or should we focus on one or the other, or can we actually work towards both? Have you thought about that?
So energy security, what really do we mean by that? What we mean is that our country, whichever country we're talking about, has adequate energy for all the things we need to do, including defend ourselves if somebody else attacks, I suppose. I sort of remember Jimmy Carter. Do you remember Jimmy Carter saying, we really need to have energy security because OPEC is taking so much control over the energy markets, and we don't want to be exposed to that. That is still the argument. We don't want to be exposed to the risks of other countries' behavior. And the Strait of Hormuz has really just re-informed us about how bad it can be to have your oil supply and your natural gas supply at risk of geopolitical events. And so I think from an energy security point of view, renewable energy looks more and more attractive, both because the cost of fossil energy is so high, which means renewable energy looks good, but also because it looks so risky. You don't want to be negotiating over your energy supply when the person on the other side knows you've got to have it. That's not a very good negotiating position to be in. So I think governments don't want to be at risk of going into some sort of a trade negotiation where you need to get the oil as cheaply as you can and the other guy knows it. So I think energy security is a big factor in leading us to more and more decarbonization. I don't know whether that's...
No, it does. Then I would ask a question that I think you will like. It's very much your style. What risks are we failing to measure? So for many years, firms, banks, they were worried about transition risk. Are we overlooking these? So are we measuring transition risk correctly, or are we actually overlooking other related risks like energy security, critical infrastructure?
Well, I think it's very complicated. I think there are lots of risks that we're not measuring correctly because the world is full of risks, some of which we can list and some of which we can't even imagine what they are, but they could happen. And so I think the strategies for dealing with this are several. One is to live in a cave and where you can grow your own vegetables and catch fish in the morning, and so you're not exposed to any of this stuff. Another is to carry out your international relations in a cooperative and effective way so that we don't really have so much risk of war and supply chain disruptions that we're seeing now.
That sounds much better than living in a cave.
Living in a cave, yes. I think
sure.
that's right. It's important to think about what's the alternative to cooperative behavior. But there are lots of portfolio strategies, and I don't want to get into it now, but there are strategies for reducing the risk of investments even when you don't know what the risks are. And some of these come from just not taking so much risk at the beginning, and others are more dynamic strategies that allow you to sort of see it as it's coming and move out of it. And I think we're going to see more of this in the future, but it's a little bit too complicated to talk about at this moment, I think.
Well, complicated stuff, you are used to it, right? Measuring risks and all that. So we have a question from the audience, more on trade-offs. So do we suffer from carbon tunnel vision? Are we paying enough attention to trade-offs in pollution, soil, biodiversity degradation, and resource scarcity?
Okay, what was the list again?
Yeah, I know it's a long list. Pollution, soil, biodiversity degradation, and resource scarcity. Are we paying enough attention to trade-offs between these?
Well, I would say we're not paying much attention to carbon risk, at least from the U.S. perspective. Could I just...
Of course.
I think we don't pay much... I mean, in fact, we're deregulating from all these risks. Any of these, you know, we've stopped regulating clean water. We've stopped regulating national parks for, you know, things that you do there. I think the idea of regulating biodiversity has really not got much traction going on. I think that the extinction of species that biodiversity often tries to prevent is being eroded as a regulatory control. So I think we're in the U.S. in a world of deregulation, and there seems to be little limit to how much deregulation really we're going to do. I think we're trying to deregulate the banks so that they can take more risk. We're trying to deregulate companies and cars that have exhaust, and companies that make a lot of smoke, and all these pollution kinds of things. It's a tough world we're looking at, and possibly we're over-regulating. But I actually think that that's not the case. And in fact, the Supreme Court just yesterday or the day before really gave a green light to the president to fire regulators that he didn't like, or he didn't think were doing well, just that he didn't like.
Let's put it that way. I think we are running a little over time. So Rob, my last word and last question, building sustainability.
Last question, okay.
Building sustainability together, right? So building, you showed a picture of your grandchildren, and you also spoke about your concerns about the future we are building and that they will inherit. So I would like to finish this session by asking you, many of us share those same concerns that you have. So my final question would be, what gives you hope, and what kind of positive final message would you like to leave us with?
You know, the thing that gives me hope is actually that all this policy, these policies that I don't really think are smart, aren't changing the way businesses behave so much. And I think that's pretty hopeful. And I think that the electorate is going to ultimately see that they don't want to have a country run the way it's being run. They're not going to, we're going to see a more humane and forward-looking U.S. in the future. And I think that will be good for Portugal. It'll be good for Europe. It'll be, I think we could even have better relations with China, and I think that would be terrific. So does that make me an optimist? I guess it does. I think
Yes, it does.
I hope some of this really happens, and I hope we're all around to see it. The meetings like this give us a chance to talk about it, make sure that collaboration, and academics and practitioners talk about this stuff, and they talk about how they want to work together. And I think everybody here would probably be delighted to work together with everybody in the US and probably in China on doing this whole enterprise better. So, thank you.
No.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rob,
Thank
for
you.
bringing, optimism back in. We very much need that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.